Welcome back, everybody, to Contracting Business Basics. I'm your host, Lori Rawlings, Executive Director of the Plumbing and Mechanical Contractors Association of Oregon, Southwestern Washington, and Northern California. And today we are going to be covering our final learning module, Learning Module 15 on safety issues. So I'm thrilled to turn it over to our instructor, Hank Brancasio. Hank, welcome back.
Thanks, Lori. I'm glad to be back. The last learning module, and then we'll do a wrap up after this one. Safety issues, it's kind of an important topic that sometimes doesn't get the attention it should get. Sometimes it does get the attention, but we're going to talk about safety issues today. So a resource of information, Safety Excellence Initiative, put out by the MCA Safety Manuals for Construction Service and Fabrication. Good place to go for more safety information. So some objectives today, we'll talk about some basic safety equipment. Not going to cover everything. Identify minimum safety training that you should put your people through, how to account for safety costs, and be able to understand what happens if OSHA shows up on a job, which is no fun. Let's just put it that way, whether it has something to do with one of your folks or scope of work, or if it has to do with some other trade on a project. So some basic safety equipment you may need to provide. So hard hats, pretty obvious. Safety glasses, non-prescription safety gloves. Safety gloves has become more popular. There's many general contractors now that require your men to wear safety gloves that have the ability to prevent cuts and scrapes so easily. These are not leather gloves. These are specifically for that reason. High-vis vest, high-vis shirts seem to be the most common nowadays. Extinguishers, first aid kits, hearing protection and lockout, tagout protection, and devices if you're doing HVAC work, service work, particularly on rooftop units and electrical equipment. You're going to need some kind of lockout, tagout protection to prevent somebody from operating a piece of equipment when it's running and dangerous. Special safety equipment, fall protection harnesses and harness. Most projects nowadays, most general contractors require this anytime you're above 6 feet. That's not very high, but you're going to need some kind of a harness. You're going to have the ability to tie this off. There's some equipment involved with this. You can purchase these. Respirators and masks. We're not talking about a simple mask here. We're talking about a little bit more complicated one. Depending on the environment that you're working in, it may require a special respirator. If you're doing work down in confined space, down in a tunnel, in a hole somewhere, you might need a tripod with a winch and a pulley. You might need coveralls and booties if you're working in an area like a clean room environment, sometimes in an OR environment, sometimes in an industrial environment where they've got some process going on and you cannot enter that space without wearing coveralls and booties. And then communication system, radios. If you're doing confined space, if you're down in a confined space, somebody needs to be outside that confined space in constant communication with the mechanic that's in that confined space. And it's going to require radios. You can't use cell phones because you may not get a signal down in that space. So some things that come into play, and until you actually get a project where you require this, it may not be as much of an issue, but when you do, you're going to find out quickly this stuff's expensive and it's required per a lot of rules and regulations on a project. Medical safety equipment provided by employees. So I got to tell you here, I got to reference you back to the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, because each collective bargaining agreement is going to have its own requirements as to what the mechanics have to provide, and each local would have that, or each trade. Boots and clothing tend to be the most common part. We don't want anybody running around naked, but there are some requirements of the type of clothing, particularly that prevents arc flash fires and so forth. If they're working around electrical equipment, might be steel-toed boots type of thing. But look at your CBA. Go back to the CBA, see what requirement is in there, and then safety training. When I ran a mechanical contracting business, despite all the safety training like OSHA 10 and OSHA 30, we had our own safety orientation. We hire a mechanic. He sat in front of a safety orientation, which might only be 20 minutes or 30 minutes long. There was a safety manual he had to sign that he received. We had a record of that. I would probably guess most CBAs today have in it that the apprentices would go through an OSHA 10-hour class and potentially an OSHA 30-hour class. But again, you got to look at the CBA. But I will tell you, in many GC contracts today, in that contract, it talks about you cannot put anybody on a job site unless they've been through an OSHA 10 and an OSHA 30-hour class. Laurie, do you know in Local 290 if OSHA 30-hour is part of the apprenticeship training?
It is.
So you got go back to the CBA, look at the CBA, see what the apprentices are going through. The challenge you'll have is that your apprentices or anybody that's, let's say, is an apprentice or has come through your apprenticeship program in the last 5 years, they probably have seen OSHA 10 and OSHA 30 hours. But you might hire somebody who's got 10 years of experience, never been through an OSHA 30-hour class. So look at your contract, looks at the terms and conditions. It might say anybody walking on this job has to be OSHA 30-hour trained. So some little tidbits of information that you need to pay attention to, because if you put a good mechanic on a job and he's not OSHA 30-hour and OSHA 30-hour is required, that could be a problem, because a lot of general contractors require a copy of their certificate, or if they find out they're not OSHA 30-hour, they'll throw them off the job. So some things to think about when it comes to safety training. So how to account and pay for safety? You could call it part of overhead, right? So if you're saying, well, I've got 15% of whatever my cost is overhead, I'm just going to pick that as a number. You could say, well, safety's in that number. That's kind of a hard way to keep track of it, simply because you lose sight of what's really in there, what's not in there. Part of a burden rate built into hourly cost. That's probably the more common way that it's done. So as an example, I'm not telling you this is the right number. Every $2 an hour, I'm going to add $2 an hour for every hour on a job to cover my safety equipment, training, anything related to that. If you do 5,000 hours a year and you're $2 an hour, you've got $10,000 accounted for to cover all your training. And I know what you might be thinking, $10,000, that seems like a lot of money. It really isn't. It adds up rapidly, because some of that stuff is got to be bought constantly. Gloves don't last forever. You might go through 3, 4, 5, 6 pairs of gloves a year, maybe more, dozen pair a year. You might go through shirts and vests, hard hats, etc. All of that stuff, it just adds up. So you want to be sure that you have an idea of, gee, looks like I've got about $5,000 or $10,000 or 20, whatever that number is. How do I account for that? Well, I'm doing $2,000 a year in labor hours in the field, or I'm doing 4,000 hours a year. How many dollars per hour do I need to put in there to cover that cost for safety? Simple as that, whether it be $1 or 50 cents or $2, whatever the case might be. And then job specific if specialty safety requirement is. So here's my one story for this learning module. When I was president of a mechanical contractor, I had a bunch of guys come in my office one day and said, hey, we got good news. We just won this project to do all this work at this facility. I'm like, well, great. And it was a pretty sizable job. And I said, what is the job? Well, they recycle mercury. I'm like, what? I didn't even think you could do that. And so this job had all kinds of specialty safety equipment. I'm talking anybody that walked into this area where they did this recycling, they had to be gowned up. They had to have booties on. They had to have special respirators. We had special OSHA training we had to put people through. Very expensive. Now, the job was large enough and ongoing enough that we could build that into the project over time. But those are the type of things that you run into. Or, maybe you're working in a confined space and you're going to need, 2 sets of radios, and you're going to need special lighting equipment, and you're going to need these harnesses and these ability that if something were to happen to a man or tradesman down in this confined space, you got to have the ability to get them out of there. So those are types of things that add up. Once you buy it once, you have it. but it's something you need to account for.
So Hank, refresh my recollection. Did we cover safety costs as part of overhead when we were going through the learning
We
module?
talked about it. We
Okay.
did. We did talk about it. I mean, I'd have to go back to the actual spreadsheet, but I believe we had something in there for things that aren't accounted for. We had a burden rate, and I believe I showed you like a $5 an hour burden rate that we
Yep.
used to do for stuff that's unaccounted for. And that
Mhm.
might include safety, or you might have safety as a separate item as an hourly cost. I will also tell you the advantage of burying it into your hourly cost is when you go for change orders and extras on a job, you're accounting for it. If it's separately covered, then it's harder to explain. It's harder to account for it. Whereas like, hey, I'm quoting a change order. The change order's got 500 hours on it or 300 hours on it. And I'm knowing that hourly rate, whatever that hourly rate turns out to be, I've accounted for safety costs. Because here's the deal. You just never know where you're going to need all the safety equipment. And it seems like in today's construction world, particularly commercial construction, they're not going to cut you any slack. They're going to expect high-vis shirts, high-vis vests, hard hats, gloves, steel-toed boots. All of that stuff is not going to slip and slide. Safety goggles, safety glasses, etc. Again, some of it's provided by the tradesmen, and some of it you're going to have to provide, and you're going to have to account for it. And it's got to be built into that cost of doing the project.
Great, thanks.
Okay, OSHA. At some point, if you're on a commercial job, I'm going to refer to this on commercial industrial jobs, OSHA will show up at some point. Either there's been an accident on a job or an incident on a job that OSHA showed up for, or they'll just show up. And so you need to have a plan. And I think that's the best way to look at it. So injuries, they're painful up to and including risk of death. I mean, we're in a trade, we're in an industry that's dangerous. It can be managed through proper safety procedures, but it's got some risk of danger. And so it's expensive when somebody gets injured. You don't want to see people get hurt. You've lost a good mechanic. There's workers' compensation, insurance costs, and OSHA fines. And that can get very expensive very quickly. My best suggestion to you is you're starting a business, you've got an insurance agent, get with your insurance agent and come up with a plan. What do you do if OSHA shows up on a job? Here's my word of caution here. You do not want your field people talking with OSHA because you just never know what OSHA is going to ask them, and you never know what they're going to say. So as soon as we had a plan, and as soon as OSHA showed up on a job, it was like all our guys were off the job, or it was someone's coming down to talk. And we had a consultant through our insurance agent that would send somebody down there to handle the OSHA side of this thing because it can get very expensive. Best recommendation is you don't want the plumber in the field, the fitter in the field, having a conversation with the OSHA agent. I mean, that's just a mistake all the way around. Better that they like, oh, wait a minute, OSHA's here, I'm getting out of here. Or I'm not talking to the OSHA person. I've called the office. Someone's on the way down here. More than happy to speak with OSHA. I mean, I've dealt with OSHA. It's not fun. And I've had to go to an OSHA hearing. Not fun. And I've been fined by OSHA because somebody made a mistake in our shop. So it's a touchy subject, but the best rule of thumb is do not have your field people talking to them. Have somebody through your insurance agent or an outside safety consultant involved as soon as OSHA shows up on a job.
Another additional resource through your PMCA membership. We have an attorney on retainer who's very experienced in working with OSHA, who has often been able to negotiate with OSHA to get fines reduced. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're facing an OSHA fine, feel free to contact me. I'll put you in contact with our attorney, and hopefully he might be able to help navigate through the system.
I think it's just the navigation process. If something goes wrong on a job that you're involved with and someone is injured or an incident occurs, then you want to be willing to sit down with OSHA, maybe you're fined $5,000 or $10,000. Sit down with OSHA, explain the situation, and maybe you can get that fine reduced. It's as simple as that. I would also tell you that many of the larger general contractors, their safety requirements in many cases are as strict as OSHA's. And if something goes wrong on a job, just take this from experience, not that anybody was hurt, but an incident occurs, it's now I got to go talk to the general contractor. I'm in a meeting with 15 of their safety people. I'm in there with their executives. They want to know, what are you going to do differently so it never happens again? That's my take on OSHA and safety issues. It's important. And my last comment on safety, and we'll wrap this up, is safety starts from the top down, not from the bottom up. It's not like, oh, well, my guys are out in the field and they're doing all that safety stuff. As the president and owner of the business, I don't need to be involved with that. That's not true. People see in the field what you're doing at the top. If the person at the top does not take safety seriously, then they're not going to take it seriously. So I will tell you, safety starts from the top and works its way down. If the person running and owning the business is a stickler for safety, the guys in the field will get it. It's as simple as that.
And it'll save you money. Because as we
Yes.
talked about in an earlier learning module, your workers' compensation insurance experience modification rate can go way up if you have an incident on a site and way down if you have a strong safety record. And the better your experience rating, the lower your workers' compensation premiums
Correct.
will be.
Right. And that wraps up safety.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been really educational, Hank. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in for Learning Module 15. We're looking forward to seeing you in our final video, which is our summary of the entire series.